Hello, YouTube. Avi here. As you know, we're coming up on elections now. Out in Israel, we actually just had elections yesterday. The U.S. is coming up on elections a little bit later this week. I wanted to talk about the concept of radical responsibility and how this sort of plays into all the different fields, including politics, but really how this touches upon every part of our lives. So first off, what is radical responsibility? You know, as someone that served as a special forces medic in the Israeli Defense Forces, a concept that was impressed upon me time and again was this concept of radical responsibility. There is no right, there is no wrong, so long as you take your fair share. And what that means is basically, after the fact, we could go through and look at any situation 1,000 times over, but none of that matters if the individual, in this case, that would be me or any one of you, is not willing to take responsibility for the situation. There's nothing to talk about otherwise, right? So everything is theoretical if we can't actually say, okay, this is on me. And so very quickly, what has happened in society, and the way this is sort of how I view it, is that we've created this environment where we're always able to go and push out onto others. There's an institution at fault. There is a generalized group, a second, a third, a fourth problem, whatever it is. None of that matters, right? The concept is the same behind all of this, and that's namely, as an individual, I don't have to take my own personal responsibility for a situation. I could go and blame that or point the finger at someone else. Now, the reason that this is so incredibly toxic is that what could happen very quickly with a mentality like this is the victimhood mentality, right? You know, woe is me, right? And this doesn't mean that all victims don't have, or that some victims don't have legitimate claims to their victimhood mentalities. And what I mean by that is people have the right to be victims. They don't have the right to be chronic victims. And society creates and fosters this lifestyle of chronic victimization, and that there's nothing more toxic than that. It prevents the individual from moving forward at the expense of a larger crowd, which ultimately that victim belongs a part of. And so the same way that, you know, while it's better for everybody overall, you end up losing yourself in the masses. What's a good way of looking at this? A great way of looking at this, and a great example of this I like to use, and, you know, being Jewish, I'll use sort of my own people as an example. The Holocaust, right? They wiped out a huge percentage of, you know, my nation from 70 odd years ago. And what happened very quickly is that we flipped that on its head. We didn't allow for this state of victimization to propel us forwards. We stood up for what we believed in, what was right. We had a chip on our shoulders, and we let the world know about that, right? Like, yes, we had power taken from us. Yes, we were decimated, but that doesn't mean that I will be decimated into the future. You know, in special forces, I would sign on, you know, sometimes really, really expensive equipment, you know, millions of dollars. And if anything were to get lost, that would fall on me. That wouldn't fall on someone else. That wouldn't fall on a third party. If I signed it on, that was on me. That means that I was willing to go to jail for that. That means, you know, whatever would happen with that piece of equipment, that was my personal responsibility. Taking this concept of radical responsibility applies to everything in life. And so what happens in politics, what happens with our democracy, right, is that, yes, there are some people, the politicians, right, that want to spend their whole life in politics. They want to spend their whole time trying to create better societies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The average Joe on the street's not really interested in that. We just want to live our lives, right? And so we take this concept of democracy and it gets shrunken down pretty quickly, right? To the point where it's like, maybe a couple of weeks before election cycles, you think about it, you look at a couple of prospective candidates, you listen to a debate or two, you're voting with, you basically know who you're voting for either way, or you're getting hit with, bombarded with an advertisement, vote for me, vote for me. And what happens very quickly is that we make decisions and we offset our own personal responsibilities onto a larger system, right? Now, when that system fails to deliver, we come back with questions, right? And now think about why that system would fail to deliver. It could be for many, many, many different reasons. But the most simple reason is that in order to actually win the vote, they have to go, horizontally as wide as possible. So I can't just say, I'm going to pick your one issue or two issues. I got to go to as many people as possible. And the larger that I make this party's policies, et cetera, the less likely I actually am to implement many of them, because what happens very quickly is that we do live in a hyper complex society. And so if I start changing little things on every single part, of the map, so to speak, things break very quickly. So where does like this concept of radically accepting my own personal responsibility come in a world where we have been trained to offset that responsibility at the slightest resistance? I think that politics is it's a magnification of where we are as society. And so the things that we hate in our politicians, it's really us reflecting out onto them. And what I see in today's world is that we actually don't really have democracy. We have a marketing campaign. We have a branding campaign called democracy, but not actual democracy, because democracy really requires self-sacrifice. It requires from the individual to really want to push forward to obtain that. And I think that we pretty much fail at that. I mean, like going and getting a little sticker saying I voted because I put, 15 minutes of effort or 15 hours of effort into something, once every 4 years, quite frankly, isn't good enough. Like we will only get the maximum of what we put in for our efforts. And the system today is designed, or rather, the way that we got to where we are in today's day and age is through technology, and technology is designed to make the least common denominator the most accessible. So things are super basic and super easy, and you don't have to think twice about them, and you just use them. And the more abstract that you get with something like that, the more you lose out on the ultimate details. Now, when those details are our actual lives, this turns and could get into a very sticky situation very quickly, simply because we need those details. The devil's in the details. It really matters what's actually happening. My politician that's going to, on a marketing campaign, like think about it like from this perspective, right? So like we live in a world now that for the last, depending on where you are, a couple hundred years, we have, one version or another of capitalism. And that capitalism has brought us, granted, untold bountifulness and amazing things. Although to be fair, that is all done by betting against our future, which is its own separate conversation. But part of what we've done is that we've really managed to unlock this culture of consumerism, and politics has turned into one more product that we serve. And capitalism's kind of like Miss Pac-Man, right? Like she'll just keep chomping until she hits a wall. She goes everywhere. And this version of unchecked capitalism has really started to eat into our democracy and really erode that away. And I think that much of what we're seeing in today's society is very much that. It's like, okay, from a consumeristic perspective, or like what is branding, right? Like when you're watching an advertisement, a commercial, etc., what are they really doing there? They're getting the biological human. They're getting you, me, whoever it is at the other end of this receiving channel. We are getting a feeling more often than not negatively linked, but we're getting a feeling that's targeting us to now go and buy a specific product or take a certain action. If we're limited by our biology and we're limited by these negative emotions, it's very easy to go and brand someone with that, right? And say like, okay, like here, you're ugly, but here's this product that's going to make you beautiful. Buy this now, 2 for 1, save money, et cetera, right? Or they'll do sort of the false positive where it's like, here's this amazing actor or athlete, buy whatever they're doing, you'll be the same as them, just do it, etc. Now, What happens is that if you do that with politics, and well, let's take that a step back for a second. How do these people actually compete with one another? They compete like, companies that are vying for the same market, share or whatever. There's a lot of negative, pointing out between the different companies. Like, oh, like, get us because look at how bad these guys are at X, Y, or Z, or look what they've done relative to us. And this us or them mentality gets exacerbated as we fight for a finite amount of revenue share. And like, yes, it's capitalism, and yes, you could always theoretically make the pie bigger, but there's only so much consumerism that we can do. We're either limited by the actual inputs, physical resources to create these, or limited to the customers to which to sell them to. So there is always a limitation. And as a result of that zero sum game, things get negative very quickly between one another, right? As we fight for this market share, it becomes a lot more about highlighting the differences between us rather than highlighting the things that bring us together. And this is exactly where politics comes in today. And so if you look at what politicians have done, is that, through no fault of their own, they're just one more product of this system, right? Like at the end of the day, we're all mirrors. And so whatever we see in our politicians are really coming from us. And so what these politicians are doing is it ends up being very often a lot of finger pointing, a lot of, oh, look what they did, look how this didn't work out, right? And then by virtue of them, everybody else being bad, choose me. All of this sort of ties back into this concept of radical responsibility and really owning one's own position in something. And today's day and age, it's much easier to offset that onto many other problems or many other people than it is to basically stand up and say, hey, I screwed up nonetheless, let's move forward. I think like this. I think that if we really want to have and effectuate real change, we have to take that responsibility. Like that has to come from the individual. And what does that practically mean? That practically means experiencing the things that we don't want to experience. It means accepting responsibility for the things that, we normally would just push away and pretend don't exist. I think a large part of that and that could be at the individual level, at the societal level. How would that manifest itself as each individual takes that personal responsibility upon themselves? What ends up getting created on the larger scale is a culture where we actually come together based on our similarities rather than our differences. And that shifts everything, because the reality is, doesn't matter what color we are, doesn't matter what race, religion, et cetera, we are all humans. And as a result of being human, we still do a majority of the same things that everybody else does. We're still eating and drinking and sleeping, these basic, activities. And there is a lot of crossover on what the commonalities are that we want. Now, when we hyper focus on our differences, then there's will always be a million ways to cut the pie, and there will be a million ways to, break apart different things that, we want to break apart. And the reality is that nobody wins in that situation, right? Like you look at in the US right now, our political parties are divided exactly in half, regardless of which side wins. Almost half the country, if not half the country, is not going to be happy with whatever policies get pushed forward after this, right? Same thing, just happened in Israel. Like there's so many ways of splitting the pie. You're always, screwing a big, large percentage of the population out of, what they truly feel is, good for them and their best interests. So, I think another point that I want to make before tying that all together is this concept of holistically looking at problems. I think that one of the largest contributing factors to this problem is that when solving issues, we tend to get tunnel vision. We tend to hyper focus down onto the issue itself. And as a result of that, when we start at a very, very narrow point of view, we lose the more broad sense of what's going on around us, right? So like I try and fix one thing in society and break 10 other things because I didn't look at this from a holistic point of view. I didn't zoom all the way out, right? Like I'm too close to the book to read the page. And one of the most important things that we can do, and this is like really, hitting it like, on the nail on the head here is like, for me, pulling together a society that is able to look at to gauge or judge one, society as a whole, and debate on the things that we want to move forward with. If we're able to do that based on common shared interests, that is about as holistic a process as we can get. Whereas if we focus on a system that's based on our differences, it's like looking at a huge pane of glass that broke on the floor and we're fighting over the shards. And the reality is that even if you pick up 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 shards, there's going to be a million more there, and we're not going to account for the whole window that actually fell out. Whereas if we're able to agree that this was a whole pane, we could actually start and deal with the larger framework of the house. And we could deal with structural issues that we wouldn't normally be able to deal with, simply because we were too focused in on that page, on that one word, on that one, dot on the page. And we missed the whole book. We missed the library. We missed the community behind that. Right. And so these are problems that are sort of chicken and egg. Right, like an institution, the reason institutions don't see paradigm shifts is because institutions are made up of people. And so we abstract the way to the institution, to the institution. The institution is us. We are the institution. And so the only way that institutions make change is if the individuals make change. And this all comes back again to radical responsibility. How do I really change, effectuate that change that I want to see in the world? By changing myself, by accepting the things that I don't want to accept. Accepting doesn't mean that I forget them. Accepting means that I process them and I come to a decision about them, and I don't let them subconsciously guide me to the next thing. As humans, like I said, we're wired for negativity. Part of that wired for negativity means that I don't remember the good things nearly as well as the bad things. And because of that, I end up tending to hold on to those bad things. And over time, that means that I ossify more and more and more and get put into a tighter and tighter box, because I don't want to feel that pain. I don't want to feel whatever that, last time that I went to this scenario and I felt X, I don't want to feel that, so I only go to Y. And then something bad happened in Y, and I only go to Z. And the next thing you know, you wake up at 75 years old and it's just the coffee and just the newspaper and just like the 10 things that you do lined up, and you do them every day and you don't deviate from that. Society today is very, very fragile because we are fighting over our differences rather than linking together on the things that bring us together. Rather than reminding ourselves that we're humans, that the majority of us just want to have, better lives for ourselves, easier work, and more fulfilling, purposefully driven lives. We want to be more sustainable. We want better lives for our children. Like, these are all the things that like politicians inherently run their platforms on and towards, but never, directly say, for fear of people just being like, well, duh, what are you, an idiot? And I think that's precisely why we're running into these issues, is that we're forgetting about that, or we're getting so caught up in what the difference between me and you is on whatever nuanced topic that we can't agree. And now you could take this even a step further, and you could say that our whole political system is not reflective of the times today. And because there's so many different types of groups, we would need a system that's a little bit more flexible than the one that we currently have. And I think that there are several answers to this. I don't want to dive into them, too much now. I want to keep this more about radical responsibility rather than, jumping on the politics side. And just speaking from my own former experience here, like probably the best soft skill that I got in the Army was learning to take radical responsibility for myself and for my actions. By learning and really, really locking into that, I become accountable for me. And so there is no excuse. And yes, there is discomfort with that if I fail or I'm seeing that I'm not succeeding at something. But that also means that I'm open to change. It also means that I can go and really, strive to take that next step forward. Whereas, very often if I just push that out onto someone else or onto something else, there will always be another excuse about why I could blame someone else, why I could, push it onto them or wherever they're going, and however that works out. So I guess my message to you is very simply, if you want to change the world, you got to start by changing yourself and by fully accepting that responsibility onto yourself. Change yourself, change your community, change the world. Can't do that backwards. And with this mindset, I say, go out, make your voice heard, go and vote, do whatever it is that you feel will make that difference for you. And remember that this gets applied across everything in life. Like the reason that I specifically, chose politics, yes, we happen to be around elections now, but politics is something that affects each and every part of these segments of our lives. If it's healthcare, if it's security, if it's agriculture, et cetera, right? Ultimately, politics is just an amalgamation of what's going on in our lives on a daily basis. Is that reflective of each piece of whatever is on their platform? Is that going to be reflective of my priorities? Perhaps not. But then again, if I take responsibility for my actions and I take responsibility for the things around me, then I'm able to now go and move forward with that and be able to really effectuate the change that I want to see. So with that, thank you. And that's about it. Have a great day.